All right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. That was very kind of you. And thank you, everybody who's joined into this session. I really appreciate that. We look for any opportunity to be able to tell our story. And it's very nice of the museum to have us back to do this to those that are listening. I'm sort of breaking this presentation into two parts, if you will. I was asked to talk a little bit about the build aspect of the original Fossmobile and the tribute or replica that is now in the museum. So I've broken it down in that particular way. So there's a little bit less of the history lesson here, and a little bit more on the discipline required to be able to build both automobiles. So it all started in Sherbrooke, Quebec. For those of you who know Sherbrooke, it's a fairly old town. It's been around a long time. And on the little map type picture on the right-hand side, you can see the Magog River running into the St. Francis River, and George's shop is right about where you see a little circle there in white. We don't have any exact location, unfortunately, but that's about the general area that he was. And on the right-hand side, while that little building on the right isn't his, it would be very, very close to that because he harnessed those fells that you see to help run his workshop. Sherbrooke is about, I don't know, an hour and 15, an hour and 20 minutes southeast of Montreal. And I grew up somewhere halfway in between. And so I know the Sherbrooke area very well personally. This was his shop. And as you can see, you may not be able to read the signs, but on the presentation slide it says electrical machine works, bicycle repair shop, and all kinds of machine done here, which are on the three signs. He was clearly a bit of a jack of all trades, and presumably took whatever business he could get to generate whatever income he could. This is inside his workshop. In the lower right corner, that is actually George working on a drill press or a small lathe or some tool. And you can see the belts and the pulley system. That's the harnessing of the river that I talked about a second ago. And those belts ran all his tools and his machines in the shop. And you can see in the left-hand picture, up in the ceiling, you can see some big wheels, which would have been the power wheels to run the machines. So George built this car. He had gone to Boston. He'd driven a battery-powered car and knew that batteries didn't work very well. And the promised ride of a couple of hours only lasted about 20 minutes. And so on the train ride home, he decided the building of the automobile with a combustion engine was the better way to go. So he somehow acquired some racing sulky wheels. He side mounted the tiller for the steering, but it also had controls that would allow you to set or advance and recline the spark. Throttle control, the gear shifting, all of that was controlled on the tiller. This particular picture has no engine yet. In fact, we don't have any pictures that show the initial or the original engine on the Fossmobile. And the cowling on the front, which you'll see later, is also missing in this particular picture, but was added presumably as a means to protect the engine. And it has no paint yet. So we always laughed as kids when we saw these pictures. Why was the seat painted and the buggy itself wasn't? We always felt that the little chair he was sitting in was probably taken from his mother's living room and the legs cut off. But in actual fact, as we've done more research around it all, it's quite likely come from a horse buggy of some kind, as would have the body box that he's sitting in. So what were his challenges? Well, there was quite a few of them. As I said, the awareness that the electric batteries weren't going to work. He had actually already invented a outboard motor, battery powered, to run up and down the two rivers I pointed out to you, and knew that the batteries would fail and he'd have to paddle himself back to shore. He had to go through some deciphering of drawings. So the ideas he got for building the engine came from Scientific America. But looking at drawings and turning those into something that's real, as anybody would know, is fairly challenging. Didn't understand compression, so that was one of his big major hurdles once the engine was built. You know, it didn't probably have the initial seals in it and the things that would allow the compression to get down to the crankshaft. So he was able to find somebody locally who knew more about combustion engines, and he helped him with the compression characteristics of the engine that he built. Same thing with respect to torque and timing, and all, you know, all these kinds of things were learning lessons that he had to go through to be able to get the engine that he had or built to run the vehicle. The sprocket ratios he probably knew fairly well because he was a bicycle repairman. And as a bicycle repairman, there's lots of gearing in the bikes, and even back in those days. So it was easy for him to figure out how to have two forward speeds. There was no reverse. And we always laugh by saying that there was no reverse, but in actual fact, the clutching system was a metal plate on metal plate, or actually a metal plate on a sprocket. And that would provide enough friction to bring it to a stop. It only went about 14 or 15 miles an hour, so you didn't need a whole lot to bring it to a stop. There were no brakes, and the muffler has not yet been invented. So this thing made a fair amount of noise, not well liked by some of the people in town. In fact, he was cited by the local mayor or a councilman or something who said that if he kept on running this thing on the streets, he'd be thrown in jail. But that apparently never happened. And then, of course, you know, for all early automobile builders, rain, snow, mud was a fairly frequent problem in being able to get around. The engine was air-cooled versus water-cooled. Many of the old engines back in those days were, in fact, water-cooled. So he decided an air-cooled engine was the better way to go. It was also front-mounted, which was fairly a new consideration, if you will, for the 1897 timeframe. He figured it would provide less noise and vibration to the driver of the vehicle, and easier to maintain. You could get to it much more easier than trying to crawl in under the seat to get access to wherever your engine might be. The engine front cowling is vented, and it's interesting. Some of the old photos we have, there are no vents in the cowling. But over time, as more pictures were taken or produced, all of a sudden vents started showing up. So their theory with the family is that he realized that if you're going to cover up your engine, you better, and if it's an air-cooled engine, you better get some air to it. So slowly vents showed up in the front, on the sides, at the top. And then we think he even figured out how to get a little heat from the engine up into the cockpit for him. Clearly, the cowling probably would have reduced the noise a little bit, so it may be something he added after he'd run it out on the streets a couple of times. We're not absolutely sure, but if people were complaining about noise, it may have been one of the ways he figured he could help reduce some of it. The leather strap recoil starter was also fairly new. Most automobiles back in those days were all crank started in some way. This was a recoil strap, just as you would start a lawnmower today or a snowblower. And all of that was in the cockpit. So he virtually could do everything within the cockpit. He could prime his engine. He could advance the spark to be able to start it. He could pull the recoil, and then he could steer and shift as he went, right, all from the steering column or the tiller. So that's our earliest picture of the vehicle out of the shop in a completed fashion. You can now see the cowling on the front, that sort of curved style piece that's hanging off the front of the body. You can see a little bit of snow still around. It came out in April 1897, so I'm not surprised to see a little bit of snow up against the side of his building. He then ran it around Sherbrooke for a few years. This, we think, are the early photos of people trying it out. That's his brother and cousin in the top photo. A friend of his in the bottom left photo, and that's him driving it in the right-hand side. So clearly a bunch of people were interested and were taking trial runs of it as it became a little bit popular, you know, with local residents. Now, if you look at the bottom, the clearest image is, if you look at the bottom left-hand image, you'll see the black square sort of hanging over the top of the cowl. It took us a long time to figure out what that might be. And we used to joke in more modern days that it was his iPad. But In actual fact, it's a flap, which we put on using leather hinges that covers an opening in the back of the cowling. Um, and that way he could reach through with a syringe that he had to prime his engine. So there was a little primer cup on top of the engine. I'll show you that in a minute. And he could put a few drops of primer gas into the top of the primer cup and do it all from the cockpit. But we think the reason it stays open, or it's often seen in an open position, is that some of the warm air from the engine was coming up through the hole and into the cockpit, and they never bothered to flip the cover back down again. So we don't know what happened to it. I drove around for 4 years in Sherbrooke, and we know of at least 1 or 2 trips back and forth to Montreal, which is in its own right quite amazing. He was ticketed in Montreal for driving on the sidewalk. If you think back to those days, the horse buggies, the horse sleds and stuff would be out on the streets, but the merchants would all clear the sidewalks. So George figured, what the heck, I'll drive on the sidewalks. And the police didn't like that. So he got a ticket for driving on the sidewalk. He listed it in Montreal for $350. He had the one buyer come down from Ottawa, and he gets up into the cockpit. My grandfather tells him exactly all the steps to be able to pull start it, but he didn't pull hard enough on the strap, and it kicked back. And he went over the top of the cowling and tore his pants, and apparently had a wooden leg that got damaged. And the quotation from my grandfather was always "no sale." He put it then in storage. By this time, he was running an automobile dealership of multiple brands, including Crestmobile and Stanley Steamers and other models. And he had put the Fossmobile in the back of the business because he just wasn't using it. He could use the cars that he was selling as a way to demonstrate to people how they all ran. And he finally sold it to somebody local in Montreal for $75, and it's never been seen since. We've made all sorts of attempts over the years. Even when my dad was alive, he and I would go around to various places hoping that somebody's garage, barn, or shed might have the Fossmobile sitting in it, but it's never been found. And with all the social media activity and all the noise we've made over the last 4 or 5 years, I think if somebody did have it, it would have surfaced by now. George was awarded for his efforts fairly late in life. He had written back in '53 a little booklet called "Recollections of Sherbrooke: The True Story of a Small Town Boy," and it's been an important reference for us because it's the only journaling or written work of anything related to the Fossmobile. I mean, most of the little book covers everything else about his life, but there are at least 3 or 4 pages about the Fossmobile, so that obviously became very useful. That got picked up nationally in the 1960s and ran in all the major newspapers across the country, which was quite interesting. As a kid, I would have only been 7 or 8 years old at the time, so that was a big thing for us as a family. And then around the same time, he received honorary memberships, one from the Vintage Automobile Club of Montreal, which is still in existence today, and we are in contact with them on a fairly regular basis. And then the much more prestigious Antique Automobile Club of America, which is probably the most recognizable automobile club in the world, and it too is still in existence today. Now, George never received any Canadian-wide recognition, and it's always been a bit of a bother to me, but I'll touch on that more in a few minutes. And then in 1897, the city of Sherbrooke and a few investors got together and figured that Sherbrooke and the city itself needed to have something to celebrate this effort. And so on the 100th anniversary, they erected this monument fairly close to where the original shop would be. You can see the river in the background. Unfortunately, and quite sadly, during the entire term for which I've been running Fossmobile Enterprises and building the replica and tribute Fossmobile, this has been in storage because they've been building a new bridge in Sherbrooke, and it was going to run right over the top of the monument. It would have been our preference that they just had replaced it somewhere else, because we and Sherbrooke has sort of missed an opportunity for people to have viewed the monument at the same time we're telling the story verbatim. So what are the challenges of building a replica or a tribute of this car? And we go back and forth with those words for a couple of reasons. In the automotive historian world and the judging world, you can't use replica because there's nothing from the original Fossmobile on this car at all. So the preferred word is tribute, but you'll hear us oscillate back and forth on those words because it's difficult for everybody to grasp what we mean by a tribute. There are no original drawings, unfortunately, but again, I'm going to cover that off in a few minutes. No original car to work from, which is obviously a big disappointment. And my grandfather passed away when I was about 14. On the positive side, we did have 8 or 9 photos, which have been extremely useful because in today's digitizing world, we can digitize those and get them in a lot greater clarity, and we'd be able to pick up on things that we wouldn't have been able to see just in the old photo itself. Reverse engineering, I knew nothing about it when I started this project, but I learned quickly how it works. And it's a very useful tool, obviously, to being able to get what you're trying to build as accurate as possible. And then I had access, I sort of figured if my grandfather could do this 125 years ago, I could do it with the help of the internet, YouTube, various professionals that were available to us. I did discover that there were parts available from the period. We had access to Crestmobiles. Now the Crestmobile, 1901 Crestmobile, first year, looks identical to the Fossmobile with the exception of the cowling. They didn't put a cowling on the Crestmobile, but everything else looks exactly the same. So we went to a museum in Boston where there's one completely restored. And as long as we didn't touch it, we were allowed to measure it, photograph it. I think we took probably about 400 or 500 photographs of it, and just the minutest of detail, and then align that and match those the best way we could to our own old photographs to be able to build the tribute car the way we needed to. And then a whole range of historians and experts. I mean, it didn't take long for people to get equally excited as us about the notion of what we were trying to accomplish. And I have to tell you that the National Association of Automobile Clubs of Canada have been extremely helpful to us to make sure that our documentation and our ability to build this car is with the greatest level of authenticity as possible. And I can quite proudly say that we've been able to accomplish that. So I started Fossmobile Enterprises, I think in the late fall of 2018, but really didn't get it underway until the beginning of 2019. It was a hobby type business for all intents and purposes, but I ran it like a not-for-profit business. So I tried to have the built-in disciplines you would want to use when doing this kind of thing. So I had a plan, I had goals, I built a budget. We did all the kinds of things. And it was about a year, maybe a year and a half into it, that I began to realize the cost of fabrication. And while we didn't have to fabricate all of it, fabricating one part, as most of any of you know in the auto world, it's extremely expensive. So I got the idea to begin to actually fundraise and set a goal of $50,000. Went after private donors, which, as you know, would always start with family and friends, and that slowly spread out with a GoFundMe campaign. But the big effort, and pretty much a full-time job, is going after corporate sponsorships. And we were able to successfully, over the period of about 2.5 or 3 years, bring in $71,000 to the total cost of the build of the project. We knew we had to get the word out. So even before we started building it, we set up a website. We put the story up on Wikipedia. The entire story now is in the Canadian Encyclopedia, which is a great feather in our cap because it'll be there for perpetuity. We did media blasts, social media activity. I think we've been in about 80 written publications, but we've been on all the major TV networks. We've been on various radio interviews and podcasts, and so we have done a lot of work at getting the word out. But it doesn't end with the completion of the Fossmobile, and it doesn't end with the presentations just like this. It'll continue for some time to come. So here's the reverse engineering aspects of things. The very first part that we got that was measurable with any level of accuracy was what's called the piano style box, which is the body, if you will. And once we got our hands on one that was period correct, we obviously could measure it down to the most acute or minor detail. And from there, everything else, we also had wheels that we could measure. So with 2 or 3 parts that were measurable, you could reverse engineer all the other measurements. And it was quite fun to do once we knew exactly what we were doing. And as I said, once we had a couple of pieces to work from. So to get going, I established an informal team of advisors. I decided I couldn't do this by myself. I needed individuals who were way more knowledgeable than I was, particularly in automobile restoration. I needed a place to put it. Before we started building it, I needed to make sure that it had a home. Well, this wasn't going to be a garage trophy that I wanted to keep and show off running up and down the street. This was something I wanted to do in a museum. I did this whole project for Canadians. And so I approached a bunch of different museums, and the ultimate choice was the Canadian Automotive Museum, which I've been very pleased with. It's been a great partnership in relation to showing the car. A network of suppliers and craftsmen who could do the various things that need to be done that I couldn't do. And again, it was a phenomenal exercise in networking and finding the right people who could also cross work with each other. So as an example, when the cowling was being measured, we had to go to the place where all the mechanical aspects were done, and we had open doors everywhere, and everybody was sort of bought into whatever role or whatever part they had to pull off this goal. And then I found an engine, a 1-cylinder, 3 3/4 horsepower engine. Had no name on it, which was, we thought, a bit unusual at the time. But it turns out that engines that were built overseas were too high a tariff to import built. So instead, they sold the trade rights to build no-name type engines in North America. So I'm pretty sure what we found was probably a tricycle engine originally, but we'll never know for sure. I then found period spark plugs, a mixing valve, the oiler. The mixing valve, I'll touch on that a little bit later when you see a picture of it, but it was the most difficult part to find from the period because there was no such thing as a carburetor back in those days. We found the 1900 period chassis and the frame and the wheels all as one piece, burnt out and a little rusty, but we knew we could work from it. Even if we had to custom make everything, it would be easier to custom make from what you see and have than trying to do it from a photograph. But as it turns out, the chassis was very usable. And the fellow that I bought the engine from, he donated the chassis and the wood body. So I'm forever grateful to the fellow down in Florida because without those parts that shortcut are getting to the end, it would have taken a lot longer to do and it would have cost a lot more money. I had the custom seat built and the cushions done locally. And the fellow who did the body work and built the cowling, he also was fairly local, just about 2.5 hours north from where I live, and was an individual who truly was an old style wood craftsman. No nails, no screws. Everything was done with the right type of glue and the right type of I don't know the names of the terms, but wood sliding into slots and spindles going into the right holes without having to put a nail in to hold it all together. And then I found a pull start handle, which was handy. Obviously, we needed to have something that would replicate what we had seen in the Fossmobile. And then the 1-inch block chain, and I'll touch on that in just a minute. It has a bit of an interesting story to it. So these are the 3 engine designs that potentially my grandfather would have been able to see or get some access to back in the day. And these are the kinds of things that were being built, all of them overseas. Atkinson is British, and de Dion is from France. But the engine that we found and the engine that is in the Fossmobile, and so therefore the one we decided to go with, was a de Dion style engine. And it sits best in the car. As I said, it has the primer cap on the top of it. It just all made sense in relation to what the possibilities were for George to build his own engine from these particular designs. So there's the engine that I bought from the fellow in Florida. You can see on the left-hand side, that's sort of how I got it. One interesting part of the story is I opened up the head of the engine and there's no piston in it. And so I phone him up and say, like, George, this thing doesn't have a piston. He says, oh, I think I've got one on my shelf. I'll send it up to you. And so I get the piston, I go to fit it in, and I'm a bit of a novice when it comes to how you might want to rebuild an engine, one cylinder or otherwise. And of course, it wouldn't fit because it was all rusty. But once we had it all cleaned up and honed down and put some rings on it, it fit in absolutely perfectly like a glove. So I was very lucky to find not only the engine but to get a piston that would fit it. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner the little tiny primer cup. It's a little valve that sits on the top, and then over on the left-hand side, sorry, the right-hand side, left picture is it finished. So it didn't look like solid brass when I got to the engine, but when you start cleaning things up, you uncover some pretty interesting highlights to what you're dealing with. The two flywheels that you see, each one of those weighs 16 pounds. So this is quite a heavy little beast. And I would imagine, once those flywheels get going, there's some continued momentum that goes along with it. And then on the lower right, you can see that the engine has pretty much been rebuilt and refinished and is kind of ready to be handed over to the mechanics that were doing other aspects of the job to get ready to mount it to the vehicle. So that's the chassis I was saying and talking about. It's a 1900 Locomobile, which was a steam car. It's numbered. It has the number stamped on the front of it, number 153. And other than the length, which was 1.5 inches longer than the piano box body that we got, everything else was pretty much exactly the same as what we could tell in the photographs and from the Fossmobile. So the truth of the matter is that many of the chassis designs and chassis builds back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, all were being built very, very similarly, all using each other's methodology on how to do it. And again, showing up in various journals that gave people the ideas on how to go about doing it. Now, George used a lot of bicycle tubing and parts to fabricate his, but this particular piece was a huge, huge find for us. And I don't have time to tell the whole story, but we had a extremely professional, high-end automobile hauler bring it up from Florida, along with a Lamborghini and a Maserati and a couple of others. And to get this thing out of the truck, it was up in the front of the semi. We had to roll these beautiful cars out, and one was black and one was white, and the neighbors were gathering around, and I kind of joked around and said, I won the lottery, it's a his and hers. And then we start dragging this thing off. It didn't roll, obviously. We had to kind of lift it and drag it, and it's pretty heavy because it's all cast iron, and then drag it into my garage. And I think people thought I'd totally gone into the loony bin. But as I said, it gave us all of the component parts to work from. And just an amazing find. I mean, the wheels, the hubs, well, the spokes don't look great. The wheels and hubs are absolutely fine. And we had to get the springs rebuilt, but we took them all apart, took them and sent them to a company out in Vancouver, and they rebuilt the springs to the exact specs of the ones that were on this. That's the body, the piano style body. You can see it has on the bottom there a foot step up. We had to remove that because George's Fossmobile didn't have that. The seat on this is completely wrong, so that went into, I think, somebody's firebox to help heat the workshop. But the body itself was perfect, and a perfect match and a perfect fit. So here are the key parts. We're starting to get to the point where we're starting to put things together. Again, the engine on the left-hand side, fully finished. The mixing and poppet valve, I mentioned that earlier, the most difficult thing to find from the period. As I said, there were no carburetors. Air would have gone into that slot in the bottom. Fuel would have gone in on the left-hand side. Your needle valve for adjustment would be on your right-hand side. And then the little PCC in the middle screws into the top, and it pops up and down with the compression of the engine through the intake manifold. So all of that was reusable except for the needle valve. We built a new needle valve for it, but everything else was functioning and worked just great. And then the little oilers, it's just it's 2 or 3 of them to show you the different styles. We ended up using the one on the left-hand side. The buzz coil, that's an important piece with these old cars. You have to take a 6-volt battery and juice up the volts to be able to get the spark plug to spark. So the wiring system goes from battery to the buzz coil to a switch and then down to the spark plug. So this is another interesting part. This is the pull start, which if you own a lawnmower or a skidoo or anything that has a pull start, it's fundamentally pretty much the same today as it was back then. You can see in the left-hand picture, it says Crest. That one that you see has come off an old Crestmobile motor. Again, our fellow in Florida, our survivor, our savior in Florida, had one. He knew it was broken, but he sent it up to me and said, you'll be able to replicate from it. And so we did just that. We built 2 exact replicas, and when I sent the old one back to him, as a gift, I sent him a brand new one, all remade for him as well. And then there's the pull start strap, leather on a handle. Pretty simple. This is the work on the body. Sorry, on the seat and body. And you can see the compound angled spindles were very difficult for the craftsmen to get just right, because not only do they go from front to back slightly, but they also come out slightly. And so apparently to drill the holes with that angle precisely and uniformly top and bottom is quite a tricky process, but he did an excellent job, and it looks very identical to the to the original Fossmobile. And then I had the upholstery done locally here with a fellow who did it using a term called spitting tacks. If you don't know what that is, the old style of doing upholstery is they put a whole bunch of tacks in their mouth, and their little tack hammers have a magnet, and they put the hammer up to their mouth and get a tack and nail it in and go up and get another one. I'm not sure how many teeth these people have left, but that's the way they do it. This is Legendary Motor Car. So Legendary Motor Car did all of the custom aspects of anything mechanical. And so this is Jason Humphreys, just an outstanding guy. I got to know him extremely well. And he just did a fine job. We put the chassis in an acid bath, and it came out pretty much as you see it there on the left-hand side. Quite remarkable in relation to its quality. The rust on it was only superficial, and you can see we've added the new sidebars because the other ones were so bent from the fire that the locomobile had been in. The wheels went to a place in London to be respoked and retired, and we had to go with white rubber because carbon wasn't added to rubber until around 1901. So we went with what George could get at the time with white wheels, which one tire, which looks more like a motorcycle tire, was more expensive than a whole set of 4 tires for your modern car today. So it's not an inexpensive undertaking. And the hubs, as I said earlier, were just fine from once we ran them through the acid bath and stuff. They were totally reusable. These are the spindles and steering arms and the linkages and stuff. And you can see a little bit of the remachining, which is quite fascinating from my perspective. You put the thing in the acid bath, it all comes out black and not terribly appealing looking. But then you throw it on a lathe and take off just a hair of it, and you get right back down to the base metal. Same thing here. You can see on the rear axle. You can see where it's been machined, and the rest of it just left as is, having come out of the acid. And it's quite a remarkable transformation for something that's 125 years old or more. In the center of the chain, so there's a bit of an interesting story here. I got to watch my time, but the top chain is what would have been on the locomobile and probably my grandfather's car as well, because it was all that was available at the time. And it's called 1-inch block chain detached. And what that means is that each link is actually 4 pieces. And when we put the thing in the bath and brought it back out again, a lot of the chain that was sort of knotted and twisted and rusted wasn't there anymore. And we kind of wondered what was going on. And the pieces that remained, we learned very quickly that it all comes apart unless there's tension on it. And so I just decided I wasn't going to go searching for the links that we needed of blockchain detached and then roll it out onto some golf course somewhere for a showing and have it all falling apart in a bunch of Lego pieces. So we got 1-inch blockchain attached, which visually looks pretty close to to what would have been used at the time. One of the advantages of calling it a tribute versus a replica is you can get away with doing things like that, and nobody questions you. This is our first and probably one of our most emotional moments when we had what we called a rolling chassis. So we had the engine mounted, the wheels were all turning, and it was beginning to look like what we had envisioned when we first started. And I can remember that day, and when we took this picture, it was quite the highlight of the entire project to see the engine mounted. As you saw in the original picture with George sitting in his car, there was no engine on that, so it was kind of a step forward from our perspective to get the engine mounted. This is the work on the cowling by the same craftsman. He, I think, said to me on more than one occasion that this was probably one of the most challenging projects he'd ever undertaken. And you can see by the number of clamps he had to use to hold everything together, it was quite remarkable, the effort to put it all together. And I won't go into tons of detail here, but there's a term called kerfing, which you would see inside of guitar boxes and things like that hold curved wood in place. And all of that is present inside the structure of the cowling. And the wood for the front of it is bendable plywood. It's a remarkable product. You can pretty much fold it into a circle. It'll crickle, crackle, and make lots of noise, but it stays completely intact. And that was donated to us by Columbia Forest Products very generously. And it worked great in relation to building the cowling. Just some more, bling, I guess, if you will. I don't think George had polished chrome or nickel plated hubcaps or hub on the wheels, or the acorn nuts. He had acorn nuts, but they wouldn't have been polished like this. But we just decided we were going to take a few little liberties just to make the whole thing pop a little bit when we were going to have it showing anywhere. You can see the sprocket on the left hand side, or the series of sprockets. That's what's called the middle jack shaft. So there's a chain that runs from the big sprocket to the sprocket on the engine, and then the one in the foreground runs to the rear of the vehicle to the differential or the sprocket on the back axle. And you can see it better a little bit on the right hand side, going from the starter pulley to the two sprockets. You can see 1 and 2 sprockets in the left hand picture. So that's how the chain system ran. This is some of the electrical work on the right. I talked about the buzz coil. We had a battery box that the battery would have sat into. And we bought all period correct wiring and wired it all up as exactly as it would have been. But we don't have a battery in it, so there's no risk of it. Somebody trying to start it. You can see the intake manifold. You can see the primer cup. You can see the oiler right in the front of that center picture. And at the very bottom of the nickel-plated intake manifold, you can see the poppet valve, or the mixing valve at the bottom with the new spindle just above the pair of pliers there. You can see it sitting there. And the gas tank. So we struggled a little bit with gas tank. Where did it go? And then we realized that the back cover behind the seat was vented. And we decided that there was the only one reason for it to be vented was that the gas tank must have been back there. So we tucked it just a little bit under the seat, and we replicated the venting on the back of the lid of the Fossmobile body, so that we're never going to put any gas in there, but to make it authentic, it looks as if it is. And we tied it down with leather straps, as we never saw what the gas tank actually looked like in the Fossmobile. But we assumed that a leather strapping like that would be an acceptable period correct approach. And then here it is. In April 2022, we unveiled it at Haggerty Garage and Social here in Burlington. Very generously, they provided us the entire facility, and we invited about 120 or 140 people. My granddaughters pulled off the satin tarp, and there's what the thing looked like when it completed fashion. Pretty proud moment for us. Now, I will say it wasn't 100% complete. It went straight back from the unveiling, but we wanted to do it in April because it was exactly 125 years to the month. So we went with what we had, and then it went back up to the shop to do some finishing before it went on to its next locations. First of which was Sherbrooke, Quebec. So we took it back to Sherbrooke where it all started. And they put on a whole weekend for us, which tied into a summer festival that they have there called Marché de la Gare, which is a period time, early 1900 period, people dressed up in costume. It was quite the showing, and boy, were the people of Sherbrooke ever happy that we brought it back. It was very rewarding to be there and listen to what people were saying. And then the biggest honor was we were invited to go to Cobble Beach, Concours d'Elegance. And this vehicle probably, or not probably, should not really be there because of its complete replica or, fabricated, nothing original from the original Fossmobile on it. But they so wanted it there because it helped to tell the story of the early automobile in Canada. And so we were very proud to take it. And it was, again, we were just swarmed with people asking us questions and talking to us about what it was and how we went about making it. We received a couple of awards along the way. So at the unveiling, the federal government issued a certificate of achievement for us, which was very nice of them. Presented virtually and online on video from our local MP. And then if you go to the right-hand side at the Sherbrooke event, we were given the Richard Evans Award, which is a Quebec award for protecting or doing something that brings Quebec heritage to the forefront. And so they presented us that award down in Sherbrooke. And then at Cobble Beach, we were presented the award, Special Recognition Award by the head of the NAACC and the organizer for Cobble Beach, which I mentioned earlier, we hadn't got any national recognition. Well, the plaque that I'm holding there recognizes our effort to build the tribute, but it also recognized my grandfather's effort for having built the original. So we can now say that he ultimately received national recognition for his efforts. And then lastly, the placement into the museum, a ceremony that was very well conducted and very well received, and lots of people attended, where we actually placed the Fossmobile on a somewhat permanent basis into the museum. I say somewhat permanent because it's now on tour, but it was a wonderful evening and a great opportunity to talk to folks about what we had done. So as we mentioned, Canada-wide tour. It's now on display at the Canadian Transportation Museum. That's down towards Windsor. And it'll be there until about November of this year before it comes back to Oshawa. And then we have other locations that are being worked on. The plan is to try to get to at least 4 or 5 locations across the country. Lastly, the whole aspect of reverse engineering. Once the whole project was done and I had nothing else to do, I figured if we could reverse engineer the car itself, could we do blueprints? And so I contacted an architect and draftsman, and he said, yeah, absolutely. Send me as many pictures as you got. And so we did. And so you see a sampling on the right-hand side. There's probably, I think, 15 of those sheets that highlight every detail of every part of how the car was built. And so while not exact, obviously, to how George would have done it, it's certainly exact to how this one was done. And we've donated copies of those to the Canadian Oshawa Museum Library and the Library and Archives Canada, which, by the way, has all of the Foss archives, all the old photographs, the old journals, certificates that he was given for those memberships, all have gone to Library and Archives Canada. They can all be pulled up and viewed on their online platform. And then we donated a copy or a set to the Sherbrooke Historical Society, so they have a set on file as well. Just really quickly, I'm not going to go through this list, but I said to you a few times that it took a lot of people to help get this done. And that's just a glance of some of what it took to build this. So while I headed it and project managed it and funded a big part of it. There was a whole host of organizations and individuals and people who gathered around us to help make it a reality. And from a corporate sponsorship perspective, a picture is always better than words. So there's lots of brands that you'll recognize there that that came alongside us to help us complete it. Time for questions, Merrick.
Thanks so much, Ron. That was great. So yeah, everyone, if you've got questions, please write them in. But in the meantime, have we been able to track? I'm always intrigued by this notion that George Foss sort of taught himself engine design. Have we been able to track down what articles he was reading? Because you mentioned you had a rough idea of the kinds of engines he had access to. Can we find the primary sources, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes and no. I mean, we've tried to find the Scientific America that he quotes in his memoir as having used, but haven't been successful at actually finding that particular edition. But that goes way back to kind of the very beginning of them, and how well their archives are. I don't know, and I quite honestly didn't spend a ton of time trying to access it, because I'd found the engine and was quite content to move forward with the engine that I had without taking up more time to prove that I had the wrong one.
Now, speaking of blueprints, I guess this is two questions in one. If somebody were to approach you and say, "Hey, I want to build a Fossmobile," first off, what would your response be to a private hobbyist attempting to build a copy of the car? And second, what would it take to make it street legal? I know we got lots of questions about this when it was first exhibited, like, can you take it out for a spin?
Yeah, I mean, I get that question a lot. Does this particular one run? And when I talked about going to the various museums to get the criteria needed to build this thing, one of the criteria was it did not have to run. And so we chose to build a static display. That's the term we use. But we did it for a couple of reasons. One, I was very nervous about starting a 125-year-old cast iron engine, where if you didn't have all of the specs just right throughout, then you ran the risk of blowing the head off or cracking the cylinder, or some damaging in some way, which would then cost you a lot of money to have to then refabricate back to an original standard. But the other factor was we estimated it was going to be another $20,000 to $30,000 to go to all of those spec requirements to try to get it to run. And when the museums had told us a static display was fine, and nobody was willing to write me a check for $20,000 or $30,000, it is what it is. But to answer your question of whether if somebody approached me, I think my first question is like, why, and what are you going to do with it? Because we're trademarked. Fossmobile is trademarked. Fossmobile Enterprises is a legal entity. So we'd want to be cautious about what somebody's plans might be and what they might want to do with it. But if you're asking whether the blueprints would be sufficient for them to be able to pull it off, a lot more so than what I had to work with. So it would be very useful to them for sure.
John's asking if there's any relationship between you and this project. Apparently there's a Foss Motors GM dealership in Scarborough.
North Toronto, yeah. No, in my entire career, I've been asked that question as to whether or not I'm related to Roy Foss, but there's nothing in our family tree or ancestry to suggest that there is.
Phil's asking, because you mentioned that the frame is sort of similar to almost a pair of bicycles. How is it all connected together? Is it welded, bolted, riveted?
It's all welded. Yeah, each of the component parts, it sort of fits together like Tinker Toys, and then welded together.
Would George have had access to welding capabilities in his shop?
It would have been brazing, I think, back in those days more than welding. But yes, he would have. His shop would have had that kind of capability, as he had a blast furnace. Now, the first engine he built, which is the one that went into the Fossmobile, he actually had the castings done by a company called Ironworks, which was just down the street from his shop. But he went on actually and built 9 other engines, mostly water cooled actually, and mostly, or if not all, for stationary purposes in the Eastern Townships area. So he never built another one to put into a car of any kind, but he did build other engines. So he had his own blast furnace as well.
This is more of a general history question because I'm always curious to find, contemporary coverage of these things. Have we been able to find any sort of newspaper articles from the late 1890s, society columns from Sherbrooke in the area, or even from Montreal talking about this car?
Yeah, the Sherbrooke Record did an article on the Fossmobile practically the day it rolled out of the shop, and have done numerous stories of it over the years. They've been one of our biggest media partners. They started the Sherbrooke Record started the same year as George built the car. And so they were looking for stories.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it is covered that way, and I believe in their records.
Interesting. I'm gonna expand on another question from Phil. Have you preserved the original sort of lack of brakes or clutch braking system? Does that still exist or not exist, as the case might be?
Nothing exists from the original. We've never found anything that
In
relates to the
time,
original.
sorry, not in terms of transferred parts. It still has the original clutch bait or the same design of non-existent brakes, as it were.
Okay, so if I understand the question, so the locomobile chassis that we had didn't have any components on it that would allow that vehicle to run other than the rear differential.
Mhm.
All of those parts either melted or were taken off or removed once the thing had been in a fire. So the jack shaft that holds all the sprockets and chain mechanisms and the clutching and the shifting mechanism, which is a derailleur very similar to how bike derailleurs work, all of that had to be fabricated. So that's where the Crestmobile in Boston became very helpful to us, because we could take very close-up photos of what the fork system looked like that allowed to move the sprockets back and forth on the jack shaft, so that the chain could jump the sprocket to get to the other gear.
Now, you mentioned that you've searched a lot for, potential, original leftovers of the vehicle, and have done a fairly thorough search of sort of I guess you could say, the market for original 19th century car parts. Do you get a sense that there's still a lot of surviving bits and bobs of sort of barn find type cars out there, or are we past the era of the barn find?
Well, my experience is that there is a fair amount of material out there. And I think what happens is it was potentially found and maybe traded in a swap meet 3 or 4 times over. And as people age, they start getting rid of stuff, and it comes back onto the market again. So there's kind of a continuum, if you will, of these vintage parts that are available. And eBay was my biggest friend. I mean, I found the mixing valve, I found the buzz coil, so many things I was able to locate and find on eBay. And yeah, that U.S. market has tons of historical items available, and as I say, they turn over from time to time as estate sales and stuff take place.
If you had to build, say you had to build a replica or tribute Fossmobile 2 completely from scratch, would you change anything in the process or in the design?
It's a really interesting question. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything, because I think we have this one. I'll answer it this way: the compliment that we got at Cobble Beach, I was told, I presented to the executive a couple days before the showing, and presentation very similar to this, and they told me, Ron, we can't judge this. It sits there virtually as a display item. We can't judge it because there's nothing original about it, which I understood. I mean, it was part of the rules when I was told I could bring the thing up there. But they came and judged it anyway, which was a huge compliment. And then one of the judges came up to me afterwards, after I was presented the award, and he said, Ron, we've seen a lot of things in our time, but the authenticity of this is as close as to what they'd ever seen. So what we would change, I think we'd have to find additional facts somewhere that would make the suggestion that we need to make a change of some kind. And again, I go back to how important the custom build was, because the degree of accuracy we could get from that, being so close and similar to what the Fossmobile looked like. And just for the viewers, the reason we think that's the case is that George didn't want to build cars. He had been approached by Ford and declined them. He had been approached by the local banker to fund him, and he didn't want that. And he was back and forth to Boston and Cambridge on many occasions to get parts for the shop. And we think either intentionally or however, he gave his trade secrets on how he built his car to the guys that started Fossmobile. And the interesting twist on that is in 1902, he became the distributor in Canada for the Fossmobile out of Montreal. So there had to have been a relationship established of some kind for him to become that distributor. So we think it's quite possible that he didn't want to do it, but if you guys want to do it, here's how I did mine, and off they went.